The gun was already pressed against Elias Everett's chest before he even had a chance to breathe. He stood frozen in the doorway of the Sadler's Creek Sheriff's office, one hand still on the worn brass handle, the cold barrel of a Colt revolver making a dent just below his sternum. The man holding it was thick-necked and red-faced, with the kind of eyes that had forgotten what mercy looked like a long time ago. Behind him, the oil lamp on the desk threw wild shadows across the wall, and in the chair beside the window, her wrists bound to the armrests with rough rope, sat Zara Slade. She was not crying. Elias registered that first. Her jaw was set, her dark eyes were furious, and her honey-brown hair had come half loose from its pins and hung across one cheek like a curtain she had not bothered to push away. She looked at him the way a person looks at someone they had already decided to stop trusting, and that look carved through him faster than the gun ever could have. "You brought him here," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the silence of that office, it rang like a bell. "You told them where I was." The accusation hit him somewhere behind his ribs. "Zara, do not," she said, and the word came out shaking, not with fear but with something far worse. Betrayal had a particular sound. Elias had learned over the years, and he was hearing it right now in the voice of the only woman who had ever made him want to stop moving. The thick-necked man pressed the barrel harder against his chest. "You going to come in quiet, Drifter, or are we going to do this the other way?" Elias raised both hands slowly. He stepped inside and let the door swing shut behind him. The desert wind pushed at it from the other side, rattling the frame, and then everything was still except for the hammering of his own heart and the sound of Zara's breathing, which was fast and controlled. The breathing of someone who had been terrified a long time ago and had since graduated into something colder and harder. He had ridden into Sadler's Creek 6 weeks ago with nothing but a saddlebag, a Winchester, and the particular kind of exhaustion that lives in a man who has been moving for so long he has forgotten what he was running from. He had meant to stay 2 days. He had stayed 43. And now here he was, staring at the woman who had turned those 43 days into something that felt, against every instinct he had spent a decade cultivating, like a beginning rather than a pause. Staring at her while she looked at him like he was the source of everything that had gone wrong. He needed to explain. He needed about 6 things to happen simultaneously that had very little chance of happening, and he needed to do it all without getting shot. 6 weeks earlier, Elias Everett had ridden in from the direction of the Sonoran Desert on a bay mare named Copper, who was nearly as tired as he was. It was the tail end of September 1882, and the sun over southern Arizona territory had a particular cruelty that felt personal, the kind that got under your collar and stayed there. He had been riding since before dawn, angling north out of a stretch of badlands where he had spent 3 uncomfortable nights after a job in Tucson went sideways in the way that jobs sometimes do. When a man has made too many enemies in too many places, and the geography of his past keeps catching up with him. Sadler's Creek announced itself with a water tower and a smell of horses and sawdust that was, at that moment, the finest thing Elias had ever encountered. He rode down the main street at a walk, Copper's hooves raising small clouds of pale dust, and he took inventory the way he always did in new places. One saloon, the Copper Kettle by its painted sign, a general store, a land office, a barber shop, a hotel that called itself the Prairie Rose, a livery at the far end of the street, and a sheriff's office with a new-looking door and a star painted on the window that still had the brushstrokes showing. It was a working town, not a boom town, the kind that had roots rather than ambitions. Elias had learned to tell the difference. Boom towns wanted your money and did not particularly care what came after. Working towns wanted to know your business, which was both more suspicious and, in the long run, more honest. He stopped at the livery first, because Copper deserved it. The man who ran it was old and gray-bearded and introduced himself as Walt, and he took the mare with the careful attention of someone who understood that a horse was more than transportation and less than a person, which was exactly the right understanding. Passing through. Walt asked, running a hand along Copper's neck. Resting a few days, Elias said. It was what he always said. Hotel's decent. Ruth Hadley runs it, keeps a clean house. Walt glanced at him sideways. You got business in town? Not yet. The old man considered that answer for a moment, and then nodded once, which was as much social navigation as either of them needed. Elias pulled his saddlebag down, slung it over his shoulder, and walked back up the street toward the Prairie Rose. He was 31 years old, tall enough that door frames occasionally required his attention, and he had the kind of face that had been outdoors long enough to show it, weathered at the corners, with gray already threading into the dark brown at his temples, which he thought was unfair, but had largely accepted. He wore a battered canvas coat over a collarless shirt, and his hat had been resoled twice and was due for a third. He did not look like a man with much, because he was not one, but he carried himself in a way that suggested the absence of things was a choice rather than a condition. The Prairie Rose had a porch with 2 chairs and a calico cat asleep in one of them. Elias stepped around the cat with exaggerated care and pushed through the front door into a small lobby that smelled of beeswax and dried lavender. There was a woman behind the desk. He noticed her the way you notice a fire when you have been cold for a long time, not slowly, not with careful assessment, but all at once, and with a kind of involuntary attention that was almost inconvenient. She was somewhere in her late 20s, he guessed, with the kind of self-possession that people sometimes mistake for aloofness, but which is actually just the look of someone who has decided not to waste time on uncertainty. Her hair was dark honey brown, and pinned up in a practical arrangement that had probably started the day neat, and was now held together by will and 2 spare pins. She wore a plain blue dress with the sleeves rolled to the elbow because the afternoon was warm, and she was going through a ledger with the focused expression of someone who had already found 3 mistakes and expected to find 2 more. She did not look up when he came in. "Room," she said. "Please. How long?" 2, maybe 3 nights. She made a note. "That will be 75 cents a night. Breakfast is included if you are down by 7. I do not hold meals." She looked up then, briefly, to pass him a key, and her eyes were a particular shade of dark brown that was almost amber in the lamplight, and she had a small scar above her left eyebrow that he thought had probably come from something she had survived rather than something that had been done to her. "Zara Slade," she said, extending her hand in the direct, no-nonsense way of someone who had decided early that the usual social dances were a waste of everyone's time. "Elias Everett." He shook it. Her grip was firm. "You are in room 4, Mr. Everett. Top of the stairs, end of the hall. The window sticks, but it opens if you hit the frame on the left side." She returned to her ledger. "Welcome to Sadler's Creek." He stood there a moment longer than was strictly necessary, holding the key, with the distinct and unusual feeling that he was standing at the edge of something that had no clear name yet. Then he climbed the stairs, found room 4, hit the window frame on the left side, and sat on the edge of the bed in the cross-draft listening to the sounds of the town settling into late afternoon, and he thought, well, 2 or 3 nights. He stayed for 6 weeks. It did not happen all at once. The way things that matter almost never do. On his second morning, he came down at 6:45, and found Zara already in the small dining room, pouring coffee from a heavy pot with the methodical efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times. There were 3 other guests at the 2 tables, a traveling salesman who talked too much and 2 cattle buyers who talked just enough, and Elias took a seat at the end nearest the window and accepted his coffee and said nothing, which was his preferred mode of operation in the mornings. Zara set a plate of biscuits and salt pork in front of him without being asked, and when she came back with more coffee she paused just briefly and said, "You did not sleep much." It was not a question. He looked at her. "How can you tell?" "Your eyes," she said simply, and moved on to the other table. He thought about that for the rest of breakfast. He had been told by various people over the years that he was impossible to read, which he had taken as a professional compliment. He was apparently not impossible for her. On the 3rd day, he helped her fix the front porch step, which had been rotting through at the corner in a way that constituted a genuine hazard. He had noticed it when he arrived and offered after breakfast, mostly because he had nothing better to do, and also because doing something useful with his hands was the closest thing to peace he had found in years. She brought him a hammer and a box of nails, and a plank she had already cut to approximate size, which told him she had been planning to fix it herself. They worked side by side in the early morning before the heat gathered. She was precise and unhurried, and she did not fill the silence with unnecessary conversation, which he appreciated more than he could easily have explained. What she did do was, at one point, laugh at something he said, and the laugh was sudden and genuine and completely transformed her face, and Elias drove a nail crooked and had to pull it out and start again. He rode out on the 4th day, as he had planned. He got as far as 4 miles south of town, where the road curved around a dry wash lined with acatillo, and he stopped Copper in the shade and sat there for a long moment with the reins loose in his hands, looking south at the empty land stretching away toward nothing in particular. He turned around. He told himself it was because he had not yet visited the land office, which was partially true. He had heard in Tucson that there were some parcels opening up in this part of the territory, and he was, perhaps, for the first time in his adult life, entertaining the theoretical possibility of staying somewhere long enough to have a reason for staying. He filed it under practical considerations and rode back into town. He extended his stay at the Prairie Rose. Zara looked at the ledger and then at him with an expression that did not reveal what she thought about this, and he was struck by the realization that he could not read her either, and that this was unusual, and that he was not sure whether it was a warning or an invitation. He spent the next week asking careful questions around town in the way he had learned to do, which was slowly and without apparent agenda. What he learned was this. Zara Slade had come to Sadler's Creek 4 years ago from somewhere in New Mexico territory, alone, which was unusual for a woman in 1882, but was her business, and she had made it clear it was her business. She had bought the Prairie Rose from its previous owner, an elderly widower named Hadley who had been ready to be done with it, using money that no one knew the origin of, which in a small town fed a certain amount of speculation that Zara had apparently decided to simply outlast through sheer persistence. She ran the hotel with 2 part-time helpers, a Mexican woman named Consuela who came in 3 mornings a week to help with the cleaning, and a boy named Tommy who was 16 and did the heavy hauling and the stable work for the hotel's 2 guest horses. She was not married and had never been, as far as anyone in town knew. She had turned down at least 2 proposals that the general store owner's wife, a woman named Agnes, who was the town's primary repository of social information, described with barely concealed relish. She was liked but not easily known. She was respected but not entirely understood. She sat on the town council's citizen advisory board, which was rare for a woman, and she had once, according to Walt at the livery, told the county land commissioner to take his revised tax assessment and file it somewhere anatomically creative, which had resulted in a revised revision. Elias thought about all of this and continued not leaving. He found reasons that were real enough to stand on. He did visit the land office, and the man there, a fussy clerk named Hooper, showed him 3 parcels and talked for an hour. And Elias listened and took the matter seriously because he was, at 31, beginning to feel the particular weight of a life lived entirely in transit. He had been a scout for the army in his mid-20s, a job he had left when he could no longer reconcile what he was asked to do with what he could live with. He had done cattle work and mining work, and some work in between that he preferred not to examine too closely in good light. He had no property and no fixed address, and a small but real savings in the Tucson branch of the First National Bank that represented 10 years of frugal living and careful work. What he did not have was a clear idea of what to do with any of it, until he came to Sadler's Creek and started having ideas. The evening that changed things, or rather the first evening that changed things, because there were several, came at the end of his second week. The Copper Kettle Saloon, which Elias visited occasionally for the social intelligence, it provided rather than for the whiskey, though he did not dislike the whiskey, was hosting what passed for entertainment on a Tuesday in a small Arizona town. A traveling pianist who had set up in the corner and was working through a repertoire that ranged from parlor songs to something that aspired toward ragtime and landed somewhere interesting in between. Zara Slade walked in at 8 o'clock. Elias had not known she came to the saloon. He had thought of her, insofar as he had categorized her at all, as a person of strict and self-imposed propriety, which was his own limitation and not a fair assessment of her. She came in with Agnes from the general store and another woman he did not know, and she wore a different dress than her usual working clothes, this one a deep green that he thought suited her in a way that was probably not his place to notice, and she had her hair down in a single thick braid over one shoulder. She saw him at the bar and nodded in the neutral, neighborly way she had, and he nodded back, and that was that. Until the pianist played something slow, and a few couples moved to the cleared space near the corner, and Agnes apparently said something to Zara that Zara clearly dismissed. And then, with a small shrug of what Elias interpreted as resigned social responsibility, Zara crossed the room and stopped in front of him. "I do not dance with strangers," she said, "but Agnes will needle me about it for a month if I do not dance with someone, and you are at least a familiar stranger at this point." "That is the least romantic invitation I have ever received," he said. "I was not trying to be romantic," she said. "I was trying to be practical." "All right," he said, and set down his glass. She was a good dancer, precise and light-footed, and she held herself at a perfectly correct distance, and she looked over his shoulder for most of the first piece. On the second, when the pianist shifted to something slower and in a minor key, she looked at him instead. "Why are you still here?" she asked. It was a direct question, offered without accusation but also without camouflage. "I have been looking at some land parcels," he said. "Hooper talked you into it." "Nobody talks me into anything." She considered this. "Then you came here intending to stay." "I came here intending to rest 2 or 3 days," he said honestly. "The staying developed on its own." Something shifted in her expression, very slightly the way light shifts on water when a cloud moves somewhere distant. "That is a careful way to say something. I am a careful man." I had noticed that. She was quiet for a moment. "What are you being careful about specifically?" He looked at her, and she looked back at him, and the pianist played something that swooped unexpectedly into a major key and then recovered, and Elias said, "I am being careful about something that I am not sure is welcome." She did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice was measured but not cold. "I appreciate the carefulness," she said. "I have not always been well served by careless men." "That is something I would like to know about," he said, "when you are willing." "That is a conversation for a different night," she said. But she did not pull away, and they finished the dance, and when it ended, she thanked him in a perfectly correct manner and returned to Agnes and her friend. And Elias stood at the bar with a feeling in his chest that he could only describe as something coming to life after a long winter. Over the following 2 weeks, the town began to know them as people who were seen together occasionally, which in a small town is a significant declaration whether either party intends it or not. They took to sitting on the porch of the prairie rows after supper on evenings when the heat broke early enough to make it pleasant, with the calico cat between them on the railing, and talking. Not about anything in particular at first, about the town, about the weather, about the land, about the books she kept on a shelf behind the hotel desk, and the question of whether the new railway spur they were debating in Tucson would reach this far south. Gradually, over those evenings, the conversation went deeper. The way water finds its way through rock, slowly and with inevitable patience. He learned that she had come from a family in New Mexico territory, that she described as difficult in a tone that did not invite immediate follow-up questions. She had been engaged once to a man who turned out to have a dark past. She had not been shown before the engagement and a set of hidden motives that became clear only after she had committed herself. And the untangling of that situation had cost her 2 years of her life, and most of what she had owned at the time. She had started over deliberately and without apology, had worked 3 different jobs in 3 different towns while saving every cent she could, and had arrived in Sadler's Creek with enough money to buy the hotel, and the specific, hard-won conviction that she would build something that was entirely and unequivocally hers. She told him this the way she did most things, directly and without self-pity, but he heard underneath it the thing she was not quite saying, which was that she had been betrayed by someone she trusted, and the scar of it was still there, not visible in the way the one above her eyebrow was visible, but real and present in the careful, measured distance she kept between herself and anything that might cost her what she had rebuilt. He told her, in return, about his years with the army, about the work he had done as a scout, and the missions he had ridden that he had thought were one thing and turned out to be another. He told her about the specific incident in 1876 that had ended his army career, which he had never told anyone in its full form. A scouting mission into Apache territory that was supposed to be a peaceable survey and turned out to be a trap set to provoke a response and justify a military action that someone higher up the chain had already decided on. He had refused the order when he understood what was happening, and the refusal had been taken as insubordination, and he had been given the choice of a dishonorable discharge or a quiet resignation, and he had chosen the latter, which had preserved his official record but left him with a bone-deep distrust of institutions and instructions, and any situation in which someone else held all the information, and he held none. "That must have been a forced choice," she said when he finished. The fire bucket beside the porch had a citronella candle burning in it against the mosquitoes, and the light of it caught the side of her face. "It felt like one," he said. "In retrospect, it was the right choice." But the how of it left a mark. "Hidden motives always do," she said quietly, and he knew she was talking about both of them. "Yes," he agreed. There was a silence that was not uncomfortable. "Elias," she said, and then stopped. "You can say it," he said. "I am trying to determine," she said slowly, whether I am being reckless or reasonable, and I find I cannot tell, which is itself a data point I am not sure how to interpret. About what specifically? She looked at him with those amber dark eyes, and in the candlelight she was entirely herself, without armor or management, and she said, "About you. About the fact that you are still here and I have started to mind less and less, and I do not know what to do with that because minding less is where everything went wrong for me the last time." He was quiet for a long moment, turning his hat in his hands. "I think being reckless would be pretending the feeling isn't there," he said at last. "I think being reasonable means acknowledging it and being honest about it and not letting either of us walk into something without knowing what it is." "And what is it?" she asked. "I am not entirely sure yet," he said honestly. "But I know I rode out of town 6 weeks ago and turned around at the dry wash, and I have not tried to leave since, and that is not something that has ever happened to me before in my life." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said with the smallest curve at the corner of her mouth, "You turned around at the dry wash." 4 miles south, he confirmed. "I know the spot," she said. "There is an ocotillo bent into the shape of a question mark." "There is," he agreed. She was quiet again. Then she said, "I appreciate that you did not pretend it was only about the land parcels." "I was not going to pretend that," he said. "I told you, I am a careful man, not a dishonest one." That small curve at the corner of her mouth deepened. "All right," she said. "That is something to work with." It was not a declaration, but it was the opening of a door, and Elias Everett, who had spent 10 years sleeping on the ground and moving before anyone could get too clear a picture of him, walked through it very carefully and with both hands visible, which was, he thought, probably the right way. 2 days later, he walked into the general store to buy tobacco and a new pair of work gloves, and the man behind the counter was not the owner but a stranger, which registered with Elias in the automatic way all deviations from established pattern, registered with him after years of work that had depended on noticing exactly that kind of thing. The stranger was a broad man in his mid-40s with iron-gray hair and the particular stillness of someone who was not browsing but was there for a specific and non-commercial reason. He was looking at the hotel across the street through the store window. Elias bought his tobacco and gloves and left, and instead of going back to the hotel, he went to the sheriff's office, where Sheriff Dan Prout, a decent, competent man of 50-something who had been the law in Sadler's Creek for 8 years, was going over wanted notices at his desk. "Who is the man at the general store?" Elias asked without preamble. Prout looked up. He had learned in 6 weeks of Elias being in his town that when the man asked a direct question like that it was worth taking seriously. "Name's Reeves," he said. "Chester Reeves. He rode in yesterday evening. Said he is in the land business." Elias turned one of the wanted notices to face him. It was 2 years old and came from New Mexico territory. The man in the drawing had iron-gray hair and a broad build and eyes that had forgotten what mercy looked like, and his name, below the drawing, was Chester Reeves. "He is not in the land business," Elias said. Prout looked at the notice and then at Elias, and then back at the notice with the particular expression of a man making rapid calculations. "What is he in?" "Enforcement," Elias said. "Private. He hires out to people who want something found or someone retrieved and would prefer it done outside of legal channels." "Who would he be working for here?" Prout asked. Elias thought about a woman with dark honey hair, and a scar above her left eyebrow, and a carefully rebuilt life and a secret she had not fully told him yet. He thought about a dark past mentioned in an offhand way, about an engagement that had gone wrong and a man with hidden motives, about the 2 years it had cost her and the shape of what she had walked away from. "I need to talk to Miss Slade," he said. He found her in the hotel kitchen, which was where she spent the mid-morning managing the supplies and planning the meals, and he came in without knocking, which he had never done, and she turned from the open larder with a look of surprise that shifted immediately into alarm when she saw his face. "What happened?" she said. "I need you to tell me about the man you left behind in New Mexico," he said. "Everything you have not told me, I need it now." She was very still. "Why?" "Because Chester Reeves is in your general store looking at your hotel through the window, and there is a notice in the sheriff's office from 1880 with his name and face on it, and his occupation listed as recovery agent." Every bit of color went out of her face. She set down the jar she had been holding with the careful precision of someone maintaining control through the mechanical ritual of doing a simple thing correctly. "Henry Calloway," she said. "His name is Henry Calloway. We were engaged in 1878. He owns the largest cattle operation in Doña Ana County, and he has connections to the territorial government that I will not pretend to fully understand. When I left, I took something with me that he considers his property." "What did you take?" She looked at him with an expression that held a mixture of shame and defiance in equal parts, and the defiance won. "Evidence," she said. "Documents that prove he was involved in a land fraud scheme that drove 3 families off their properties. I took them because I found them by accident, and I knew what they were, and I knew what would happen if I left them behind. I have kept them for 4 years because I did not know what to do with them that would not bring him down on me, and every time I started to find a way forward some other thing demanded my attention, and I told myself I had time." "You do not have time anymore," Elias said. "No," she agreed. "I do not." She looked at the jar in her hands and then set it on the counter. "He has never given up. He will not stop. He has too much to lose. Where are the documents?" "In the lining of my traveling case, in my room." "All right," Elias said. "Here is what we are going to do." He went to Prout first, because the situation required legal standing and Prout was both the law and. Elias had determined over 6 weeks of observation, fundamentally honest, which was not a given for small-town sheriffs in the Arizona Territory in 1882. He laid out what Zara had told him with the particular, organized clarity he had developed during his years as a scout. When unclear information delivered clearly was frequently the difference between a good outcome and a dead one. Prout listened without interrupting, which was another quality Elias appreciated in him. When he finished, Prout sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "If those documents are what she says they are," he said slowly, "that is a federal matter. Land fraud in the territories falls under federal jurisdiction." "I know," Elias said, "which means Reeves operating here as an agent for Calloway is unlawful on several counts, and it means those documents need to get to someone with the standing to use them." "There is a federal marshal in Tucson," Prout said. "Marshal James Carver. He is a straight shooter. I served with him before he got the marshal's appointment." "How long to reach him by wire?" "Telegraph office opens at 8. If I send this morning, I could have a response by tonight." Prout paused. "But that still leaves Reeves here today, and if Calloway is the kind of man this woman says he is, Reeves is not going to wait around nicely once he works out that she is here and the evidence is here." "No," Elias agreed. "He is not." The plan they formed was imperfect, which was the honest nature of all plans, but it was the best available use of what they had. Prout would go to the telegraph office immediately. Elias would stay close to Zara and the hotel. If Reeves made any move before Prout heard back from Tucson, Prout had the authority to detain him on the existing warrant, which was still technically valid from New Mexico Territory. provided they did not look too hard at the question of interstate warrant enforcement, which, Elias thought, they could afford not to. He went back to the hotel and told Zara the plan. She received it with the same focused attention she gave everything, standing in the kitchen with her arms crossed and her jaw set. When he finished, she said, "And you trust Prout?" "I do." "How much?" "Enough to bet on it," he said, which in his language was the highest possible endorsement. She uncrossed her arms. "All right." She looked at him steadily. "Why are you doing this, Elias?" "Because Reeves is in your town and you are in danger, and I have the specific skills set to be useful." "That is the practical answer," she said. "I am asking for the other one." He met her eyes. "Because you matter to me," he said, without decoration. "And what happens to you matters to me, and I am not going anywhere until I know you are safe." She stood there for a moment looking at him, and something in her face softened in a way he had not seen before, which, given the general architecture of the moment, which was tense and frightening and involving a man with a gun in the vicinity, struck him as remarkable. "I should have told you about the documents sooner," she said quietly. "You did not know you could trust me," he said. "That is a fair position to take with a near stranger." "You are not exactly a stranger anymore," she said. "No," he agreed, "I am not." Reeves made his move that same evening, which was sooner than Elias had anticipated, and later than he had feared. Prout had gone to the telegraph office and received a wire back from Marshal Carver in Tucson by 4 in the afternoon, confirming that the warrant on Reeves was valid and extended to the Arizona territory, and that a deputy would be on the morning stage. This was good news. The problem was that Reeves had apparently been watching the sheriff's office and saw Prout at the telegraph window. And 2 were quickly 4 in the mind of a man whose profession required that kind of arithmetic. Elias was on the hotel porch when he saw Reeves cross the street toward the sheriff's office, and he stood and moved to intercept him. But by the time he was down the porch steps, Reeves had already cut around the back of the barber shop, moving fast for a broad man. And by the time Elias understood what he was doing, Reeves was already at the hotel's back entrance. He found him in the sheriff's office 5 minutes later, having somehow neutralized Prout, who was sitting dazed against the wall with a contusion above his ear, and having somehow located Zara, which Elias could only explain by the fact that Reeves had clearly been watching the hotel long enough to know its layout and its inhabitants. And so he was standing there in the doorway with a gun against his chest and Zara's eyes on him across the room. "You told them where I was," she said. "Zara." He kept his hands up and his eyes on both Reeves and her. "Listen to me. I know how this looks. I know what you think. But I need you to hold on to one thing right now, which is that I went to Prout this morning because I recognized Reeves and I was trying to protect you. Every move I have made today has been toward that." "He came straight here," she said, and her voice was cracking now, not with doubt but with the effort of holding too many things at once. "After you spoke to Prout." "Because Reeves saw Prout at the telegraph office," Elias said. "He was already watching the street. He knew something was happening. I did not lead him here, Zara. He was already here." He looked at Reeves. "Is that not right? You were already watching the hotel." Reeves gave him a look that was not quite confirmation but was close enough. "Quiet," he said. "Where is Prout?" Elias asked. "Sleeping," Reeves said. "He will be fine." He reached with his free hand into his coat and produced a folded document. "Miss Slade, my employer wants his property returned and a signed statement that you will not seek to cause him any further difficulties. You do that, and you stay in your hotel and continue your quiet little life, and we all go home." "That is not a proposal," Elias said. "That is a threat. Call it what you like." "Your warrant from New Mexico is valid here," Elias said. "The federal marshal in Tucson confirmed it today, and there is a deputy on the morning stage. You have about 12 hours before this becomes very complicated for you." Reeves looked at him with those flat, empty eyes. "Then I need to be done in 12 hours. "The documents," Zara said suddenly. Both men looked at her. "You want the documents," she said to Reeves. "You do not actually need me for anything except to tell you where they are, and Elias already knows where they are." She looked at Elias. "Go and get them." Elias understood what she was doing. She was redirecting Reeves toward the thing he actually wanted, because if the documents were the primary objective, then she could use the documents as a tool rather than a vulnerability. But it only worked if the documents did not simply end up in Reeves's hands. "Get them," Reeves said to Elias. "And come back. Any idea you have about doing something clever while you're gone is a bad idea because I will know." Elias looked at Zara one more time. She gave the smallest nod he had ever seen, barely a degree of movement, but it was clear and it was deliberate and it meant, "I trust you. Go." He went. He went up the stairs to her room, which was the first door off the landing, the room she kept for herself while the guests used the others. It was neat and personal in a way the rest of the hotel was professional, with a woven blanket on the bed in yellow and red, and a framed photograph on the dresser of two women who might have been sisters. The traveling case was on the high shelf in the wardrobe, and he opened it and found the lining and found the documents folded inside oilskin exactly as she had described. He also found, under her pillow, which was where he would have kept it if he were her, a small Remington Derringer. He took both. He came back downstairs and into the sheriff's office and handed the oilskin package to Reeves, who took it with the particular relief of a man whose employer was going to stop breathing down his neck. Reeves opened it and checked the contents quickly, and in that moment of distraction, Elias moved. It was not elegant. He put his left hand on the barrel of the gun and twisted it hard to the outside while stepping to the side, which removed the threat of discharge toward his torso, and used his right elbow on Reeves's jaw with enough force to sit him down. And then he was behind him with the man's gun arm twisted up his back and the Derringer against the side of his neck. "I am going to let you go," Elias said, not loudly but with perfect clarity. "And you are going to sit in that chair while I untie Miss Slade. And then you are going to stay in that chair until morning when the deputy arrives, because the alternative is that the next several minutes become much worse for you. Are we clear?" Reeves was breathing hard. The flat eyes had acquired a new awareness that was either respect or fury or both. "Clear," he said. Zara held perfectly still while Elias untied her wrists, and when the rope fell away she shook her hands out carefully and flexed her fingers and said nothing for a moment. Then she stood up from the chair and picked up the oilskin package from the floor where it had fallen and looked at Reeves with an expression that was not triumph, but was something colder and steadier. The look of someone who had just decided, once and for all, that they were done being afraid. "Tell Calloway," she said, "that the documents will be in the federal marshal's office in Tucson by Wednesday. Tell him to speak to his attorney." Reeves said nothing. She walked out of the sheriff's office into the last light of the September evening, and Elias, who had found some rope under the desk and was tying Reeves efficiently to the chair, finished what he was doing and checked on Prout, who was coming around with a headache and a great deal of swearing, and left the two of them there and went outside. Zara was standing in the street with her arms wrapped around herself, looking at the first stars appearing in the blue-gray above the eastern hills. She still had the oilskin package held against her chest. Her hair was half down, and the wrist where the rope had bitten was marked with a red line she kept touching with her other hand without seeming to notice she was doing it. Elias stood beside her. He did not speak immediately. "I am sorry," she said at last, "for what I thought." When I saw you come through that door, you thought the worst, he said. Given your history, that is not irrational. It was not fair, she said. You had told me you were on my side, and I immediately assumed the opposite. Zara. I am saying, Zara, he said more quietly. Look at me. She turned and looked at him, and he could see the shaking she was suppressing now that the immediate danger was past, and the body was beginning to assess what had just happened. He stepped toward her, and she stepped toward him, and then she was pressing her face into the side of his neck with the absolute exhaustion of someone who had been holding everything up for too long. And he put his arms around her and felt her shake for exactly 45 seconds, and then pull herself back together with a long, deliberate breath. She stepped back and looked up at him. Her eyes were bright but not spilling over. Thank you, she said. You are welcome, he said. She looked down at the oilskin package. We need to take care of this tonight, she said. Before anything else. Prout can hold Reeves, Elias said. In the morning we will put the documents on the stage with the deputy. Tonight, he hesitated. Tonight I think you should eat something and sit down. She laughed, small and tired and real. You and your practical approaches. It has served me well. Before the stage left, Reeves looked at Elias from the window with those flat eyes and said, Calloway is not done. He is done with her, Elias said. Because whatever he does next happens in federal court and under federal investigation, and there is not a land baron in the territory with connections solid enough to survive that. He knows it. Reeves said nothing more, and the stage pulled out, and the dust of it settled on the street and then was still. Zara stood beside Elias watching it go. The morning was cool and sharp, the kind of October morning in the Arizona territory that reminds you the desert knows more than one temperature, with a sky so blue it looked painted. She breathed it in and let it out slowly. It is over, she said. The document part, he said. The legal proceeding will take months, but yes, the danger part is over. She was quiet for a moment. I have been carrying that for 4 years, she said. I did not realize how heavy it was until just now when it is not. He looked at her. What do you want to do? What do you mean? You have been running this hotel and guarding those documents and keeping yourself at arm's length from anything that might complicate your safety, he said. And now none of those things are necessary in the same way anymore. So what do you want to do? She looked at him, and in the morning light her eyes were very clear and very amber and very direct. What are you asking me, Elias? I put an offer on the north parcel, he said. The one Hooper showed me with the creek and the stand of cottonwood. I did it last week. Hooper accepted this morning before the stage arrived because I went by early. He paused. I am asking what you want to do because I would like to know whether what I want to do is possible or not. And what is it that you want to do? Stay, he said. Here, in Sadler's Creek. On that parcel, which will need considerable work, and near this hotel, which will need no work from me because you run it better than anyone in the territory could. And near you specifically, which is the part I am asking about. She looked at him for a long, full moment, and he stood there in the dust of the departed stage and the clear October morning and waited, because he was a patient man when he needed to be, and because he had meant what he said. Whatever she said was going to determine a great deal, and she deserved the space to say it without any pressure from him. You turned around at the dry wash, she said, 4 miles south, because of an ocotillo in the shape of a question mark. That is accurate. And then you filed a land offer last week. Also accurate. You have been planning to stay for some time. I have been hoping to stay, he said. There is a distinction. I have been hoping. I did not know if it was the right kind of hope until the last few days, and now I do. She reached out and took his hand, which she had never done before. Her fingers were warm and steady, and she looked at their joined hands for a moment and then up at his face with an expression that was open in a way he had not yet seen from her, unguarded and clear and no longer at a careful distance. "It is the right kind of hope," she said quietly. "It is." He held her hand in both of his and stood there in the October morning in Sadler's Creek and felt something that was, after 31 years, entirely new and entirely welcome, which was the sense of being exactly where he was supposed to be. They did not rush. This was important, and both of them knew it, because the rushing was what caused the mistakes, and they had each paid for enough of those already. What they did was go slowly and honestly, and with the particular, deliberate attention of two people who were taking the thing seriously. Over the following weeks, Elias worked the north parcel with the focused energy of a man who had found a purpose, which is a specific and powerful kind of energy. The land had not been worked in years and required clearing and grading and the laying of a foundation for the small house he was building, board by patient board, with the help of a local carpenter named Samuel who charged fair prices and asked few questions, and seemed to understand, from some professional or personal intuition, that the work mattered beyond its materials. He came to the hotel for supper most evenings, because Zara had begun including him in the household's mealtime without making a formal event of it, which suited both of them. They sat at the kitchen table after the guests had been served, and the dining room was cleared, and they talked about his work on the land, and her work in the hotel, and the slow, satisfying process of two lives finding the points where they aligned. There were harder conversations, too, because they were both honest people and the territory of what had happened to each of them was not entirely comfortable. She told him more about Henry Calloway, about what it had been like to discover that the man she had agreed to marry had been keeping secrets that implicated him in harm done to real people, about the particular horror of realizing that her own good faith had been used as a shield for his bad acts. She said it without drama, but with a quiet, contained anger that was entirely appropriate to what had been done to her. And he listened without trying to fix it or resolve it, because some things are not for fixing, only for witnessing. "You came back," she said. "I came back," he agreed. "And then I kept not leaving until not leaving became what I was actually doing rather than the default result of not yet leaving. There is a difference." "You make a lot of distinctions," she observed. "I spent a lot of years in situations where the distinctions were life and death," he said. "It becomes habitual." "I like it," she said in the simple, direct way that was characteristic of her. "The precision of it." He looked at her across the table, in the kitchen light, with the desert night pressing at the window and the calico cat asleep on the chair in the corner, and thought that this was the specific kind of happiness that did not announce itself with fanfare, but arrived quietly and stayed. In December, the federal court in Tucson formally issued a warrant for Henry Calloway's arrest on 5 counts of land fraud in the New Mexico territory. The letter notifying Zara arrived on a Tuesday, and she read it standing in the hotel lobby and then set it very carefully on the desk, and stood there for a moment with her hand flat on it, pressing down as though she needed to confirm it was real. Elias came in from the street and found her there. He read the expression on her face before he read the letter. "Good news, the best kind," she said, "the permanent kind." He read the letter, then he looked at her. She was smiling, which she did not do lightly or often, and the smile reached all the way to her eyes, and the scar above her eyebrow caught the light at a particular angle, and she was, in that moment, so entirely herself that he felt the full weight and privilege of knowing her. "Zara," he said. "Elias," she said, mock solemn, which was her occasional mode of humor. "Will you come and see the house?" She had not yet seen the house. He had told her about it, described its progress. mentioned its proportions and the angle of the windows and the cottonwood visible from the south side. But she had not come out to the parcel yet, partly because she was busy and partly, he suspected, because she was giving him his own space in which to build something without watching over it, which was a generous and perceptive thing to do. "Now," she said, "if you can spare an hour." She looked at the lobby, looked at the letter, looked at him. "Consuela is here," she said. "Let me tell her." They rode out to the north parcel in the early afternoon, on copper and the hotel's steady gray named Patience, and the December air was cold and clean and smelled of juniper and distance. She rode beside him without talking, which he had come to recognize as her version of attention, the way she was fully present in a place when she was not filling it with words. The house was not finished, but it was standing, with the roof on and the windows in and the door hung, and it had the particular combination of solid and spare that he had aimed for, something that could become home without pretending to be something grander than it was. He showed her through it, the main room with its fireplace, the kitchen space with the window that framed the cottonwood, the two smaller rooms at the back, and the porch he had built along the south side to face the afternoon light. She walked through each room without speaking, and he followed her and let her take it in without narration. She stopped in the kitchen at the south window and looked at the cottonwood for a long moment, its winter bare branches making their intricate geometry against the sky. "2 rooms at the back," she said. "Yes, one for a study," she said slowly, "and one—" She did not finish the sentence. He waited. She turned from the window and looked at him, and in her face was the particular mixture of want and care and courage that he had been watching develop across the months since September. The slow dismantling of the careful distance she had built around herself, and the emergence of something else, something she had protected so thoroughly that he was not sure she had been entirely certain it was still there. "I am not good at doing things halfway," she said. "I know that," he said. "If I am in," she said, "I am in. And I need to know the same is true for you, because I have already lost 2 years of my life to a man whose commitment was conditional on what it cost him, and I cannot." She stopped. "I cannot. Zara." He moved toward her and stopped close enough that he had to look down slightly to meet her eyes, which he did, without flinching or equivocating or looking for a way to cushion what he was about to say. "I turned around at the dry wash, and I have not stopped turning back toward this town ever since. I bought this land. I built this house. And I am asking you, directly and without any ambiguity, whether you would consider making your home here with me. That is not a conditional proposition. That is a complete one." She looked at him for a very long moment. The cottonwood branch outside the window moved in the cold breeze, and a bird somewhere in it, too stubborn to migrate, made a brief, decisive sound. "Yes," she said. "I would consider it. I have been considering it. I believe my consideration is complete." He kissed her then, which was the first time, and it was unhurried and warm and genuine, the way things are when there is no longer a reason to be cautious. And she put her hands against his chest and kissed him back with the whole of herself, which was how she did everything, fully, and without holding back the peace she had finally decided he had earned. They were married in February 1883, in Sadler's Creek, on a Saturday afternoon when the winter light had the particular quality of cold silver over the desert, and the air smelled of wood smoke and dry grass. The ceremony was held in the meeting hall because the small community church was too cold to heat adequately, and the whole town came, because that is what small towns do, and because Zara Slade had been part of Sadler's Creek long enough to be genuinely loved by it, and Elias Everett had been there long enough to have become genuinely known, which in a place that size amounts to much the same thing. Agnes from the general store cried, which surprised no one. Walt from the livery stood in the back with his hat on his knee and a look of simple satisfaction. Samuel the carpenter was there with his wife. Consuela brought tamales for the reception, which she had stayed up the previous night making, and which were the finest thing on the table by a considerable margin. Prout, whose head had healed completely from the knock it had received from Chester Reeves, gave a speech of precisely the right length, which is to say short enough to be remembered and long enough to say what needed saying. Zara wore a dress that was somewhere between dark green and the color of old pine, because it was the color she wanted, and she was not interested in convention for its own sake, which was, Elias thought, among the things he most admired about her. She walked in without fanfare and stood beside him in front of the judge they had brought up from Tucson, and looked at him with those amber eyes steady and clear and entirely present. And he thought, here is the specific gravity I have been looking for my whole life. The thing that makes a place home is not a parcel of land or a set of walls or a particular latitude. It is this. This person looking at you like you are worth being looked at. He said the words they asked him to say and meant all of them, and she said hers, and he heard the difference between words said and words meant, and the difference was present and unmistakable. And when they were done, the judge said what judges say, and Elias kissed his wife in the meeting hall in Sadler's Creek with the whole town watching, and thought, with the clean, clear conviction of a man who had finally stopped moving, I am home. They moved her into the house on the north parcel, which took 2 days and involved a great deal of reorganization. The hotel she kept, because it was hers and she had built it and it mattered, but Consuela's hours were extended and a second helper hired, a sensible young woman named Ruth Ann who learned quickly and had good instincts with the guests. Zara ran the Prairie Rose from a slight distance now, handling the accounts and the decisions and the management in the hours of the morning while Elias worked the parcel. They had their first argument in March, which was about whether to fence the southern boundary of the parcel before or after the planting, which sounds like a thing that does not matter, and was actually a disagreement about priority and planning, and the particular kind of stubbornness that 2 strong-willed people inevitably encounter when they begin to actually share a life. The argument was direct and honest and moderately heated, and was resolved at the kitchen table over coffee with a practical compromise. And what struck Elias afterward was not the argument itself but the resolution of it, the fact that they could reach one without either of them having to capitulate entirely, and that the reaching was not difficult, only effortful, which is a meaningful distinction. In the spring, Zara began a kitchen garden at the back of the house, because she had always wanted one and had never had the right ground, and she planted it with the same methodical attention she gave everything, learning from the ground up what would grow in the desert soil and what needed amendment and what needed patience. She had a particular talent for patience when she believed the outcome was worth it. She told him in May that she was pregnant. She told him on the porch in the late afternoon, with the last light falling across the cottonwood and the kitchen garden showing its first green. And she told him directly, in the way she did everything, without preamble or softening, and then watched his face for his response. He said, after a moment in which several thousand distinct and overlapping things happened in his chest, "Are you well?" "I am well," she said. "Good," he said. And then, unable to manage anything more articulate because articulation was not available to him in that particular moment, he stood up from his chair and pulled her to him, and she laughed against his shoulder, that sudden and genuine laugh that had made him drive a nail crooked on the hotel porch the very first time. And they stood on the porch of the house he had built in the Arizona Territory while the evening came on, and the first star appeared above the eastern hills. The baby came in November, when the desert was cold and clear and the cottonwood had gone yellow, And it was a boy who arrived with great inconvenience to everyone involved and considerable noise thereafter, and was generally, once they had gotten past the exhaustion, an extraordinary development. They named him Thomas, after no one in particular, because they agreed that a child should have his own name and not someone else's. And Thomas Everett was from his first weeks a person of strong opinions and remarkable lungs, and a look in his dark eyes that was, Zara said, entirely his father, which Elias took as a compliment. The years that followed were not without difficulty, because the wild territory of Arizona in the 1880s was a place where difficulty was not optional. There were dry years, and the things that came with them. There was the question, ongoing and not easily resolved, of what was happening to the Apache people in the territory, whose land had been taken, and whose rights were being systematically dismantled by a government that operated on a logic of expansion regardless of what was already there, and which Elias felt with particular acuteness given what he had seen in his years as a scout. He and Zara talked about this, seriously and more than once, and it was one of the harder conversations they had, because there was no easy resolution to it. Only the acknowledgement of what was unjust and the decision about what, within their small sphere of influence, they could do, which was sometimes very little and was always imperfect, but was more than nothing. Through all of it, the through line was constant, which was this. They faced things together, directly and honestly, and with the combined intelligence of two people who had each survived difficult things independently, and had discovered that doing it together was both harder and better, in the way that most things of real value are harder and better simultaneously. Thomas was 3 when Zara told Elias she was pregnant again. This time she told him in the kitchen while she was making biscuits, because it had come up in a natural moment, and she saw no reason to formalize it more than it already was. He had been reading the Tucson newspaper at the table, and he set it down and looked at her, and they shared a look of complete and mutual understanding that contained, as so many of their shared looks now did, an entire conversation. "Thomas will be pleased," she said. "Thomas will be jealous for 6 months, and then proprietary for the rest of his life," Elias predicted. She laughed. "Probably accurate." The second child was a girl, born in the summer of 1887, and they named her Clara, after the clearest-sounding word either of them knew, which is to say after the quality of the thing, which was what it was. Clara arrived with more patience than Thomas had, and immediately demonstrated that patience was not the same as quietness, and she settled into the house on the north parcel, and the life there, as though she had always known exactly what she wanted, which, Elias and Zara agreed, she probably had. Zara leaned against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. They stood there for a moment with the evening light on everything, and the desert smell of dust and sage coming up on the cooling air, and the sound of Thomas now explaining to the cat, in authoritative and entirely one-sided terms, why it should come back. "I have been thinking," she said. "About what?" "About the prairie rose," she said. "About what to do with it in the long term. Consuela's daughter has expressed interest, and I think she has the capability. I could sell it to her at a fair price, the kind of fair that actually means something, and she could build what she wants to build with it." "Is that what you want?" "I have spent a long time building things from scratch," she said. "I am not done building, but I am interested in building different things. I thought about a school." He looked at her. "There is no proper school in Sadler's Creek," she said. "There is the arrangement with Mrs. Fuller, who teaches reading in her front room to whoever turns up, which is better than nothing but not by as much as it should be. If I sold the hotel to Consuela's daughter, I would have the capital and the time, and Samuel could build a proper schoolroom, and there is precedent in the territory for—" She stopped. "You are smiling." "I am," he said. "What?" "I am thinking," he said, "about a woman behind a desk in a hotel lobby who told me breakfast was at 7 and she did not hold meals. And I am thinking about how that same woman is now describing a school she is going to build in this town. And I am thinking that the distance between those 2 points is one of the more remarkable things I have witnessed." "The hotel desk woman is still very much present," she said. "I know," he said. "I am grateful for all of her." She looked up at him. "You turned around at the dry wash," she said, "for what was perhaps the 20th time in 5 years, not as a refrain but as a reference point, the way certain memories become the shorthand for everything that followed from them." "I turned around at the dry wash," he confirmed, "and stayed." "And stayed." She reached up and touched his face, briefly and with the particular tenderness that had no performance in it, the kind that exists only between people who have seen each other clearly for a long time. "So did I," she said, "in my own way." Thomas caught the cat. There was a brief and joyful scuffle, and the cat extricated itself with dignity, and Thomas sat down in the dirt and laughed. And Clara, from her patch of grass, made a sound of pure delight at her brother. And the evening settled around the house on the north parcel with the slow, golden completeness of a thing that has arrived where it was always going. Elias Everett, who had ridden into Sadler's Creek one September morning in 1882, with a tired horse and a saddlebag, and the accumulated weight of a decade spent in motion, pulled his wife close and looked at what his life had become, and felt, with perfect and lasting clarity, the answer to every question that the dry wash and the ocotillo in the shape of a question mark had ever asked him. The question had always been, "Is there somewhere you can stop?" The answer was here. The answer had always been here. Waiting on the other side of a door he had been given the extraordinary luck to push open, and the woman beside him had been on the other side of it with her ledger and her amber eyes and her complete, astonishing, hard-won self, and she had let him in. He had found the one town he could not bring himself to ride away from. He had found it because it contained the one person who had made staying not only possible but the only thing that made sense. And he had understood, when he turned around at that dry wash 4 miles south, that the question mark in the ocotillo had been his own, and that he had, finally, found the answer. He stayed. He stayed for all of it, for the seasons and the difficulty and the ordinary miracles of breakfast and coffee and 2 children growing up on the north parcel under a sky so wide it required a different kind of breathing. He stayed for the school Zara built, which opened in the autumn of 1889 with 14 students of various ages and a proper slate board, and a teacher brought from Tucson, and which Zara ran with the same methodical, uncompromising, completely loving attention she had given everything she had ever built. He stayed for all the evenings on the porch, the ones with good news and the ones with hard news and the ones with no news at all, only the sound of the desert and the weight of her shoulder against his, and the slow, accumulating knowledge of a life lived well and fully, and in the specific place that was, against all of his considerable history of departure, exactly where he was supposed to be. The drifter had found his town. The town had found its own shape around him, and the woman who had rebuilt herself from nothing had built one more thing, alongside the man who had finally stopped moving, and it was the thing that held all the rest of it up, which was a life, a whole one, full of difficulty and beauty and the ordinary, extraordinary work of 2 people who had each known enough darkness to understand, when they finally found the light, that they had better hold on to it. They did. They held on. They stayed.